You also, when we get to you, let me know what kind of question you have about the game. So like when I take a game and play through it for the first time to get a sense of like what happens in the game, while I'm doing this, the player who played the game can tell me like, here's what I'm wondering about from this game or something like that. Hey, Halgilde. Look at this. It's your game. Whoa. Surprise, surprise, seeing myself here. All right. So I'm just going to click through a little bit here and interesting. Very complicated moment right here. Wow. Wow, complicated. All right, there go all the pawns. Cool. All right, well, since both opponents are here, Nordvik, Halgilde, what questions do you two have about this game? Nordvik, oh, right, you had a question about Rook B2 early on in the game, right? Huh? Rook B2 is not possible on move 14. Maybe it's a typo. Maybe it wasn't move 14. 44. Here you also can't play Rook B2 because you're in check, but okay, maybe it's going to be like this move here. Good question, Halgilde. Yeah, I'll tell you about your opening. Okay. Question is whether or not Rook B2 is kind of the critical move, whether or not there's a better alternative. I mean, the odds are, Nordvik, that your advantage has already slipped away before here. I could say that. Just first blush. Like, I think this endgame got out of control for you when the knight came to e5 and the rook took your f5 pawn. Right? So, I mean, you may have a better move here than Rook B2. My best guess would be Rook B3 right here. But I think that your advantage slipped significantly when you gave white the c-file right here. You're technically up a pawn here, but when you give white the c-file, they've got the c-file, a passed pawn, the idea of knight c6 to e5. Sorry, like in the game. I think the advantage that you got earlier has probably already disappeared. Now, I think you and Halgilde are both aware that black got a good position out of the opening. That's why Halgilde is asking me a question about the opening, because Halgilde's got a sense that the opening didn't go well for them, right? And you're asking me a question about the endgame because you're wondering, like, didn't I have the advantage and did it slip away? So I think that shows you both have an instinct about the shape of the game, which is the shape of the game is white's opening was sort of like lame or non-impactful. Black got the upper hand, black got an extra pawn, and then the advantage really sort of like slipped away from black. And white drew the endgame fairly easily, honestly, with like several options for how to draw it. So at the high point materially, you're even up 2 pawns instead of 1, but by then actually it's sort of temporary. Like you win the d5 pawn, but white's got the knight on e5 and wins back their pawn immediately. So I mean, I would say like by the time you're winning the second pawn, which is right around here, it's very, very temporary that you're winning this pawn, right? Because white just went and attacked this pawn and you lost it back immediately. Right? I mean, you were only up 2 pawns for like 1 move, like on the board. And I think like a computer would never say that you were up 2 pawns because, you know, you can't defend the pawn. If you did this to defend this, then white could check here and then here. Now white's threatening rook takes pawn check and rook takes pawn, and you definitely can't defend this pawn. You might not be able to defend even 2 pawns, right? So it might be just dead equal here. Basically, like, you could try to defend that pawn while getting some space for your rook for a counterattack. White goes check here, here. And, I mean, odds are things are not that advantageous for you. I mean, you have this, you can still keep playing, but probably white has enough counterplay at this point to keep the game interesting. Probably, right? So anyway, let's go back a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, okay, so your question about this rook b2 moment. So here, basically, the problem for you is that the white rook and knight are well coordinated. White's going to win this pawn, break up your structure over here. Your only way to like win this game would be like a passed pawn on the queen side. Now, I think your bishop might be slightly better than the knight if you could just get a pure rook trade with this move. And of course, this stops knight takes g6 as well by trading off the rook. If white takes, you're technically still up a pawn, although this one might be in grave danger, right? But technically, you're up a pawn for a moment, and more importantly, you've got bishop versus knight with the 2 pawns on 1. This position here would be an advantage for you, even if white wins this pawn pretty quickly. You've got an edge, although the king position is a major problem. I'm definitely not feeling like you're winning. I don't know how many chances you have, but I would prefer to be you at this point. And then the other critical point of this rook b3 move is that if white goes here, you now have the move e3 check. That's really my huge point. Because if you were just taking here and they take here, this is not that amazing for you because the white pieces are so great. Right? Like, even if you go here and you're like, oh, I'm still up a pawn for a moment. The thing is, like, with the positions of the white pieces, you know, you can temporarily, like, gain a pawn or two, but all you're really doing is trading off all the pawns, right? There's no real chance of winning here. Does that make sense? So here, the way I was hoping to try and win for you, Nordovik, was with this e-pawn getting wild. While the knight is very strong, but it's blocking this move, the knight can't move while the rook's undefended. So we're just going to try and make it a little bit tricky for white here with the bishop, rook, and pawn to try and get this thing through. And the idea is, after king here, staying in front of the pawn, bishop b5. We threaten back rank mate. And it's slow for the white pieces to get into position to deal with this. And hopefully we can at least get the white pieces very passive here. I guess there's one defensive move here to block on this rank. And if you make that trade, are there any chances to win still? We could play e2, trying to give the rook check. We can play rook here, keeping the king stuck and going after this pawn. Maybe here. That looks pretty tough to deal with, right? Rook check and queens. On knight f3, go rook check. On king here, rook check, you win the rook. And on king here, rook check, and then you just take the knight. That does it. So that's my suggestion right here, Clark, in this position where you're asking about rook b2. I notice rook b3 is an interesting move. Because if white takes the pawn, e3, it's just a tactical calculation. If I got it wrong, then you shouldn't go for this. You should only go for this if it doesn't allow rook takes g6. But if it gets you this position here, then this could be somewhat interesting, right? You've got a choice between bishop c2 or bishop d5, then trying to run the b pawn. So that's one thought once we get to this point. However, I do feel like things got a little bit out of control for you. And like, for example, in this position where your opponent played rook g5, Clark, at this point, I already think that white is probably easily equal with just rook check, king here, rook here. Instead of going to g5, the rook can attack 2 pawns at once from this direction, right? And if white can take away, start chipping away at your queen side, like you got nothing left to win with, right? It's important in these positions to know which pawns are like the potential queens. That's how we know which pawns are more important. Which pawns are like the candidates for actually winning the endgame, right? To some extent, black could lose every single pawn on the king side and win with just the b pawn if it goes through. Because the knight's going to get cut off and be awkward against it and it's far away. This pawn has the potential to just win the game. And you see the bishop already controlling 2 of these squares. So we have to know which pawns are really, truly dangerous. And that has to inform our endgame play. Pawns are not at all equal in the endgame. Even though pawns are like more valuable and you're like, oh, being up or down a pawn might be important. But actually still, you know, you don't have like pawn sacks for checkmates or for attacks that you have in the middle game. But still, you can get pawn sacks to like accelerate your other stuff, right? So like in this position here, where g6 was played, which allows this strong rook coming to the 6th rank, you know, it might be better for black to just play b5 or something for all I know, right? Saying like, yeah, you got my h pawn. That's not my winning pawn, right? Then what does white do from this position? The knight can't move because the rook's undefended on this row. And this pawn's threatening to come down. The king can't cross the d file. And these 2 squares are already defended. So white needs to get somebody to b2 like really, really soon. And the rook actually that went and took on h5 is awkward here, right? White has to play a move like rook h4 probably in order to play here, 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 knight c4, and the knight covers b2. And it's a complicated fight, you know, coming up here. It's not sure that that knight's going to be successful because this rook is like 500 miles away from the queen side. I mean, what's his route even going to be to ever get back there? So, and the king's cut off. So it's like this knight by itself fighting the black everything except the king. So that's something very, very important to learn about the approach to this endgame, and it can apply to both white's moves and black's moves throughout this endgame, right? That white needs to recognize the value of this pawn here, and black needs to recognize the value of this pawn. This is your candidate pass pawn. You've got a pawn majority, right? So this is your candidate pass pawn, and it's also your only way to like win this endgame. In this position here, you know, one defensive idea from black would be this. Similar to the rook f6 I kept telling white to play, right? If you play this move for black, you defend this pawn, you defend this pawn. You also have the idea when the pawn advances that your rook could always get behind it. So we make sure to hold on to our important pawn. Now, I mean, as with anything in chess, you know, you have to calculate variations to see if it actually holds up for you. You know, rook here, king here, bishop d3, knight e5. I mean, you have to calculate some things and see if they do or don't work. White also has an idea of f5 here with pawn takes, rook check, king here, rook takes. That's creating counterplay for white, making some space for them. But in theory for black, I mean, you should be willing to allow something like that more than allowing white to, trade off your queenside pawns. Because here you've got a chance to win, and they've got, some chances too. So like, in this position, I probably wouldn't even spend a move on g6 because rook f6 I think is clearly good for white. So I would just try pushing the b pawn here and sack this. As white, if g6 comes in, I would definitely keep my rook able to go to both sides of the board and look at black's b pawn. And after rook g5, rook b5, no. Here I would be considering probably rook d6 to defend the pawn, or b5 b4 just trying to run it. But this rook activation is not super impressive to me. Here, as white, I might defend with the move. Let's see, if rook takes, it's rook takes knight, right? So maybe here, like knight c4 going after these pawns makes sense. Rook here. This was definitely awkward, this rook coming over here. Anyway, it's a lens, right, that allows you to look at every single move in this endgame in a new way, right? So rook b3 could maybe be dangerous, getting this going, dealing with that pawn. And in this position here, yeah, again, I would take with the rook with white, not the knight, and then head over this way with the rook, right? Even if this pawn escapes, I want to be able to watch it from here. Now, maybe I shouldn't just play so silly and cavalier and just lose things for no reason. Maybe I should play g3 first. But I have the option to play rook b6. Even if I don't play it now, you can see that my rook can get to b6 whenever I need to, and that gives me a defender. So I would watch that throughout the endgame. Now let's talk about the setup that goes into getting to this endgame. Here, you're kind of like burning energy in order to give up your bishop pair and then give up the c file. So this sequence of moves here, starting with rook here, gave me a very bad taste. At this point, Clark, I think your advantage is at its greatest. You're up one pawn, not two, but look at this. Your rook looks pretty active. Your bishop, you've got the bishop pair. Your pawn structure is solid, and the d5 pawn looks a bit weak, right? So to me, this is the high point of your advantage right here. And what should be the priority here? I think we've recently had a queen trade, which is a great time, right? Huge transitions like the queen trade are a good time to sort of readjust to what we're doing. And you played f5 here. But normally right here after the queen trade, this is where I would think of what my priorities are now that we're in an endgame instead of a middle game. You missed bishop a4 winning here. On which move? Probably after the queen trade. f5. Bishop a4 here winning? Probably not. Here, 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 here. Maybe here, because if the knight moves, you win the bishop on e3. Yeah. That's much nicer. Which is funny because in this position here, Nordvik, the move I was thinking of was bishop a4. Although we're really jumping the gun now. But let's forget about, rook c3 and this bishop a4 tactic and what move David would play here. And let's say right after we get a queen trade, what should we be looking at for black in this position? What should your sort of first steps in this endgame be? Right? You've traded into the endgame. Hopefully you recognize you've got an extra pawn in the bishop pair. That's a great start. Enough to be thinking about this endgame in terms of like, I'd like to win this endgame. So, what do we want to do in a position like this? So Nordovik's interested in activating the queenside pawn majority. And Basil and Drittman are both in my camp. My camp is the rook on f7. The first thing to do when we get to this endgame is to make this rook on f7 better. Because, very often right after a queen trade, the goals in the position change a little bit. And so we need to redo some development. like an endgame phase of development. You know what I mean? Like your pieces might be in the right positions for some kind of middle game you were playing. Then when you get to the end game, some of those pieces might need to be on different squares to be well placed in the end game. So often you get sort of like, you can call it a remaneuvering or a repurposing of the pieces, but you can also kind of think of it like development, right? Like the rook on f7 needs to be developed. It's not on the right square at all. Your bishop pair is decent, but this rook here should be on one of 3 squares, I would say. It should either be behind your b pawn or on the open file. Now, that part I'm pretty sure of, that that's the priority, right? But now let me tell you the part I'm not sure of. I don't know if the rook should immediately get behind these pawns and we start pushing them, or if we should go to the open file. I have a strong instinct, but I don't trust my instinct. But I'll tell you what my instinct is. My instinct is that the c file is too valuable right now. That the queenside pawns are not yet far enough advanced to really be looking to like push them home yet with the rook behind them. And the open file, plus the fact that white has a passed d pawn, and this is like the adjacent file to white's passed pawn, I still think that there's maybe enough fighting going on between the 4 pieces on the board that we should try to control the open file, the c file. Okay? So, hey Heim, you wanna give me a game for today? Sorry to interrupt myself there, Norbik and Halgilde, but been trying to get Heim in for a long time. And the timing doesn't always work. Absolutely possible, Heim. I'll jump you in the line, in the queue. You know, Heim won a prize in a Mega Rapid. So we're gonna give Heim some priority today. All right. We've got a question. Can you still get in on the classical thing? Absolutely, Paulson. Anybody else who wants to play in the classical tournament, hit !classical. Follow the link to the spreadsheet. There's a registration tab which you can freely edit to put your information in at the bottom of the list. You need to go down around line 100, I don't know, 45, 50, something like that to get in there. Yeah, this is from the previous one, David. I haven't yet been able to process the current one because there were so many cheaters. I have to go through and rearrange all the points, and it's just onerous. I know you hate the cheaters, but you can also blame them for just giving me way too much work. I bet you did. There were so many cheaters that near the top, and you're pretty near the top. You probably won something. I just don't know what yet. Sorry. It's pretty darn annoying. I hate doing that kind of, you know, useless, needless work, you know. It's like cleaning up broken glasses after your kids throw them on the ground on purpose. Anyway, let's get back to this game here. Oh, Cheesy, you shouldn't withdraw after getting cheated. You should just report it. The cheater probably got kicked out. You get a new game with someone else next round who won't be cheating. It's very, very rare that you have to play against a cheater. So you need to just accept that it's going to happen now and then and let it bounce off of you. Don't give them the power over you to like spoil tournaments or spoil your days, you know. All right. So back to this game. So we know the priority, or I don't know if we all agree, but the priority I'm announcing is to get this rook into the game. I don't know for sure if the rook should go behind the pawns or onto the open file. Okay, but it should be one of those two things. And you've got a nice option of rook f8 to c8. And I also think that either like, you know, bishop b5 or bishop a4 might be a really nice move here, right? Followed by bringing the rook here. One nice thing about bishop a4, sorry, knight c2 got played, and it was here that I was saying for black, bishop a4. One nice thing about this is it blockades this pawn, which is potentially a target, right? Which will make it harder for the white pieces to come and fight us, for the white rooks to come fight us if this pawn's getting targeted. It's already attacked by 2 pieces, so it's nice to immobilize it. And we may later have tactics against this knight, right? With rook c7 or rook b2 or rook c3 or something. So that's why I come up with this move suggestion here of bishop a4 Nordvik. It comes from the fact that I'm looking for the ideal way to get this rook into the game, but I'm also noticing, like, hey, my prospects are largely on the queen side. Hey, we are still having like a battle between these pieces. Hey, let's immobilize something if it's a good target for us to attack. And that's an isolated pawn that already 2 of our pieces are attacking. If you let the pawn move, you have to reorganize to attack it, right? So I really love to immobilize something if I'm already ready to go after it. So my guess is that this is a fantastic move for you, Nordvik. And, you know, white's going to play something like, you know, king f2 defending this. Oops, they lose a piece, right? White's going to want to play a move like rook c1. Oops, they lose a piece. It's actually a little bit awkward for white to pick their next move here, right? And if they end up playing a move like this to overprotect this, stop rook b2, maybe be able to defend this bishop and defend the knight like this. Do you see how passive white just went? Right? If they're trying to defend stuff along the sides and you've got control of both of these files, you're in really, really good position now to you know, win the A pawn or the D pawn, one of these isolated pawns, when the knight eventually gets traded by your bishop. So you'll move this rook at some point, you know, to c3 or d3. You'll trade the knight, and then you'll win one of these 2 pawns and play rook and same colored bishop with 2 extra pawns. So yeah, white's going to be very, very passive and constricted here, right? We're going to come down like this and, I don't know, play here with like rook d1 or, I don't know, some kind of offense. Does rook c2 already work? Let's see. Rook c2, rook c2, rook check, rook here. Rook here, rook here, rook here would be great, but there's rook check. But Driven probably calculated something I didn't calculate yet. Okay, so the question is, does rook c2 work? Maybe on this move. Maybe on some other move. We'll see. So here, rook takes, rook takes. Okay, it has to be rook here. Now it's probably rook check or rook here or something. Yeah, you were having trouble in the middle game, Halgilde. We'll talk about how you could play the opening so that we'll have both a lesson for Nordvik and for you in the same video here. I don't see the tactic. You wanted the 2 bishops for the rook. So maybe you wanted to play rook e3 and didn't have rook c8 check in your line. I mean, maybe just a move like this is pretty good. King here, and you've got the idea of trading here and then taking this pawn. Although, I would argue this pawn can't get away, so maybe like bring your king to e6 and then take the pawn. Or spend a move on f5 defending this and then bring your king in. I don't know. I feel really not pressed for time as black. But you probably have enough of an advantage that something like here, 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 here is already winning. I mean, it's 2 pawns up for nothing with same colored bishops. So yeah, I mean, if you want to, if you're not nervous that this A pawn's getting away from you, consider trying to, you know, put the pawn on f5 and then king on e6 before you go for any trades. I don't think that white's going to have some brilliant way to fight out of this. I mean, you will have to calculate the move knight before now and then, but I think if you trust yourself, you can handle that. Here would be an example of where you do have time, right? Like in a position like this, you could say, okay, the opponent's constricted. I play f5, king here, king f7. And, you know, other options come up as well, right? Like, and this is like the thing about white being constricted. It's so much easier to play for black. Black's got all these tactics, and each move black can check if they win or not. And and every move white has to be sure that they don't, right? So here, if this move, then rook takes c2 wins the pieces, right? If rook back, then we go bishop here hitting the knight. right? Now the knight's got to move somewhere, and then maybe this pawn drops. Here, I think you didn't want to trade into opposite colored bishops. So how about rook c3? Threatening a3. Maybe white can defend it like this. This is really asking a lot out of white's position to try and survive what's happening here. This. There you go. We won a second pawn again, right? And white is still constricted. We haven't given the c file to get a second pawn. We've still got all the white pieces in crummy position, right? We're threatening e3 to like maybe win this bishop at some point. If knight takes, pawn takes, it's hard for white to stop this, and rook c2. This is the difference between like having this rook operating at 100% versus at like 10%. And it's like, it should feel somewhat the same, Nordvik, to what you've learned about like openings, right? Where if somebody leaves, let's say, their queen, rook, and queen, knight on the two starting squares and play with all their other pieces, like they know to sort of develop, but they just forget like one or two pieces and start playing with the others. Like it is a drag on their position. It was a drag on your position that this rook didn't come out. And when it comes out, you can see how much easier this is to play. So hopefully you feel just how strong your advantage was here with my approach of bringing out the rook versus the struggle you had in the game, right? Where you're like counting pawns and like tactics, trying to stay ahead one or two pawns, because that's what you sort of like understand as to like being able to say like you're finding your way to maintain your advantage. It's like from pawn to pawn and calculation to calculation. But you could make it much stronger here by developing the rook. All right, now let's go back and find something here for Halgilde about this opening, okay? So let's go this far here. So here, Halgilde played h3. I know, Nordvik. I know what you were thinking. So here white played h3. That, as you guys discussed with each other, is not going to be a good move. It's slow and it does nothing, right? And then Nordvik played bishop f5. Now, Nordvik, you've had one or two games where you brought your bishop out to f5 too soon, right? And Seth or somebody else played a move like queen to b3. And then it was like awkward, you're under pressure like this, right? Well, h3 has justified it, my friend. Here you have full permission to play bishop f5. That is a very mild punish. You could say, or whatever, right? It's like white has just given you permission to do something that you can't normally do. And I love that you didn't play bishop f5, you know, before bringing out your knights here, before securing your d5 pawn, right? So on h3, you've been given permission. You're not going crazy. You're not sacking your stuff, right? But they play h3. You have to know how much you're allowed to take. h3 allows you to develop your bishop to a nicer square than normal. The end. Don't think that you can win a pawn from white. Don't think you can checkmate white. You're black. You're black. Let's be reasonable. They've played an h3 that seems basically pointless in this particular position. So you just put one piece on a better square than you normally get, and then you just keep developing and, you know, see what comes up. Position's probably about equal. All right. White plays bishop b5. Also not a good move, because Halgilde, do you want to trade your bishop for this knight? Do you have significant pressure against black? Is black going to have trouble defending the knight? Or is black going to lose control over like d4 or e5 or something related to this knight? I would say black is both secure on this diagonal, and if white plays knight e5, it does nothing. And this may remind some of you who saw the first episode of Dojo Rivals of an opening between Charlie and Seth. Seth, who plays this Tarrasch defense as black most of the time. And there was one opening of Charlie's in the entire event, I think, which didn't go well for him. And it was the game where he played bishop b5, pressuring a knight that wasn't under pressure, then knight e5, pressuring a knight that wasn't under pressure, and then after they both castled, Seth could just win a pawn on d4 or e5. I don't know if you guys remember that, but it looked, I think Seth put his queen on c7 or something, and, you know, it's like knight here, here, here. I'm just going to show you guys what kind of a position it was. They got to some position like this, right? And because white had no interest in trading here, all it does is lose time, right? Like, knight takes, pawn takes. Oh, I have to retreat, and oh, black center just got stronger, right? Or bishop takes, pawn takes, black center got stronger, and I gave up the bishop pair. I'm weak on light squares. What's this one doing, right? So in that game, you know, Charlie just kept developing normally. I don't know, you know, b3, a3, bishop d2, something like that. But basically, just straight out of the opening, Seth could have won a pawn with knight e5, pawn takes, queen takes. Because this knight was just, it was just an overplay, right? It wasn't putting any pressure, and that means it itself was had wasted time going to a square that white couldn't support. And Seth actually took this way and then didn't take the pawn, but could have taken the pawn on d4 or e5, right? So the knight on f3 was not improved by going to e5 if it wasn't generating any pressure. It was actually weakening white's control over d4 and e5. And that's an important thing to realize about a situation like this, that knight e5, you're actually weakening your control over e5 because your knight was controlling e5. So if a move like this doesn't put an unpleasant pressure on your opponent, a move like this is actually weakening your own control of the center. And it's that same thing where when you go aggressive with your pieces, you're actually putting yourself in more of an exposed or dangerous situation. So you better be sure that your threats are going to force your opponent into defensive positions or passivity or bad moves or concessions. Because if you're not forcing your opponent to play bad moves, you're going to regret the extra time you spent on these moves. Okay, so in this game, Nordvik played queen b6, which is just as good as queen c7. You know, it puts good pressure on the d4 pawn, and it looks at the bishop, which says, okay, this knight has to keep that bishop defended. We're really looking at this bishop's likely to just trade for the knight, which is going to be bad for white, and then black's, you know, going to like put pressure on the b2 pawn or put pressure on d4. So this is good. And now white plays a3, which is again completely pointless, and bishop d6, castles, castles, rook e1, knight e4 going after the defender of the bishop. And this already starts forcing some concessions from white. It's a tricky calculation that there's this, so he can leave this pawn undefended. Another move that could be good here, Clark, would just be the move c4. Gaining space because your opponent's wasted time. And you're also looking at the fact that b3 was weakened by this a3 move. So any position like this, and notice that I'm going to mess up your structure on purpose here, though queen c6 is also playable. But a position like this, white's going to be in even worse shape on the b file. Why? Because it's harder to play b3 when the a pawn's moved, weakening this square. So again, you want to attack things that are immobilized, right? So this pawn here is like easily immobilized, and you can put tremendous pressure on it already. Also, white's going to struggle with controlling their light squares, so they won't be able to play rook b1. They won't be able to play queen c2 to defend this pawn because they can't oppose this bishop or get out of it, right? So, okay, but that's just, you know, how Clark's building a good position. Let's talk about how to improve a couple of these moves from Halgilde. So it's h3, bishop b5, a3, 3 moves in a row, which are just absolute lemons. And after 3 bad moves, Nordvik, you can definitely go into like, okay, I'm punishing mode, right? Like, I'm going to get a positional advantage. Now, the position is closed enough that you shouldn't look to win the game, right? White hasn't created any huge weaknesses, and the position's not open. So that the time that white's wasted with these 2 moves, that's like making you like white plus. This move here is probably going to lead to a bishop for knight trade, which is going to be bad for white, but not something that gets white mated. So you need to calibrate your punishment as I'm going to lock in a positional advantage. So, and I know we've worked on that. Hopefully that's where you were at this point, Nordvik. We're trying to lock in a positional advantage for black. Okay. All right. So, Halgilde. What's wrong with the bishop b5 move, hopefully I've explained to you, it's that you don't actually want to trade this knight. So you're better off putting the bishop on e2 or d3. Just a normal square. D3 is the best diagonal for the bishop. E2 lets you use the D file to attack the isolated pawn on D5. Okay, so either move, they're probably about equally good, approximately. They're each very playable. If you played either move, nobody would really rag on you about how the other move's probably better. I mean, maybe like a super GM would see some reason why in this position it makes a huge difference which square you put the bishop on. But everything that I know says that it's basically a matter of taste here. So we know what's wrong with bishop b5, right? What's wrong with h3? What's wrong with a3? What's wrong with them is that they're wasting time. That's it. They're just wasting time. What do you want to do in this position? Probably find squares for your bishops, castle king side. Right? So you want to move towards those moves pretty quickly. Bishop d3 could be met by c4. Yeah, black could try that. They could say, hey, I'm going to gain a temp off of that to play the c4 move. But I wouldn't say, Pizza Trainer, that this would necessarily refute bishop d3 compared to bishop e2. When you drop back here, you're going to be easily able to play e4 in this position. And when you play e4, black's pawn structure will not necessarily be amazing, right? The fact that black took the pressure off of d4 allows you to play e4 and your d pawn is strong enough. In this position here, you wouldn't be threatening e4, right? Because you just lose the d4 pawn. In the example I gave where I played c4 for black, which was something like that. No, sorry. Other variation. Let me see. I'll find it. No. c4. Okay. In this variation here, Pizza Trainer, part of my reason for playing this c4 move I played here for black was that it didn't look like white could play a very good or quick e4 against me. Does that make sense? Because I've got the bishop here and white's bishop's out there. So it's going to be very hard for white to play e4, which would be the counterplay against this. The other counterplay against c4 is the move b3, trying to undermine the pawn. Again, hard for white to get. White doesn't have the best b3 here as well. Although maybe that's the best defense at this point now that I think about it. Like the best way to try and stay in the game. But basically, yeah, I mean, black's well poised for both of white's possible counters, so it's a great time to take the space. Also, when I played c4 Pizza Trainer, white's already spent time on h3 and a3. c4 is a move which trades time for space, right? It uses up some of your time to gain space. What could we do instead of c4? We could play rook e8, we could play rook c8, we could play rook d8, right? Like, we could try to get our rooks into the game. So when we play c4 in this position here, or we could spend time trying to get the bishop pair, right? Like Clark chose to use his time to get the bishop pair. By threatening the knight on c3, he tried to get the opponent to take here, right? So when you've got some extra time, you've got a choice of how you spend it. You could try and grab space. You could try and take over a square you like. You could try and get your rooks activated. Something like that, right? The move c4 is saying, like, space, I'm willing to give up time for space. Well, you can afford to do that when your opponent's already given you extra time, so you've got time to spend. In the other example, where I play bishop d3 here, I haven't given black much time yet. You play c4 for free, but as far as supporting the space you've grabbed, if you count tempi, white still has their half tempo lead, right? This bishop is out before black's bishop, and now it's black's move. So white hasn't really squandered any time yet. So you're grabbing space, but you're going to fight to justify it because white has enough time to, like, counter, right? White hasn't gotten behind in development. They can fight you. And this pawn can be strong or weak depending on how well black can support it and how good the white pieces are. So I would be surprised if, like, c4 at this point would, like, refute bishop d3 at all. It's probably just a move that black can try. Personally, I wouldn't even play it as black. I would prefer to just keep developing. I'd be a little bit worried that c4 pawn would get a little bit loose. That would be I would be slightly concerned about that, but there are probably ways to play it as black. Okay, so what you need to do, Halgilde, next time you play a chess game or this structure, is you need to figure out what you want to do with these bishops and get castled, right? So I would say bishop e2 and bishop d3 are good options for this bishop, and the only good option I see for this bishop is b2. So I would probably play... Now, to play the bishop to b2, you're going to have to play b3. If you play this move order, you need to worry about this, this, this. This can be awkward as white, because you basically end up just losing a tempo defending the knight here with like a passive defensive move. You also have to watch out for knight e4, and you even have to watch out for castles rook e8 check, because black's suddenly like a moment ahead of you in time, right? If we go here, well, we're not putting the bishop where we want it ever. We'll have to spend more time putting it somewhere good later. Castles. Now you can't play bishop d3 because of rook e8 check, right? So you've got to settle for bishop e2. Now black just takes like a slightly better diagonal from you. Black doesn't overplay it. They just say like, okay, I'll take a nice diagonal. You know, and castles, castles, and the game goes on. But you can see black got a very comfortable opening right here already, right? Like if you just flip this position back and forth in your head, you want to be white, you want to be black. I think everybody's already going to say like, I'd like to be black. It feels like black is white. It's not like they're like crushing or anything. It's just like, this is like the kind of position you would expect white to get, right? Just slightly better squares for some of the pieces. A little bit faster on the rook to the e file or the c file or whatever, right? So that b3 move, you know, I told you you want to find a square for this piece, but that b3 move here can get slightly punished sometimes by bishop b4. Hence, I'm going to suggest bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, castles, takes, here, b3. Okay. Hey, you want to come in? And now I'm going to put your bishop where you want. You notice I'm doing like a couple little fine moves. It's fine if you don't play everything as precisely as what I'm suggesting, but if I play b3 to go here, I'm just slightly not pumped about this move, which whether or not I trade knights or don't, either way, I'm not really going to play bishop b2 anymore. Right? So now I'll come this way, and I just have this random b3 move, which is a mild weakness of my knight not being on a supported square. So I just maybe have a slight preference to trade like this first and go here, and then bishop to b2. And I'm happy with that. We'll just make one quick comment. Pizza Trainer saying a3 b4 feels more natural to them. I mean, it gains a little bit of space, but at a cost of time, right? a3 b4 takes 2 moves, where b3 takes 1 move. Probably play like this for black. And you'll find that a3 was kind of pointless. So, yeah, it's just the tempo thing again. There are many positions where white does play a3 b4. Like, when you say it feels natural to you, it probably means you've seen that played many times in positions like this. So it's the first thing that pops into your head. It's just like, it's like a positional pattern recognition, right? You've seen like GMs grab that little bit of space. And it is pleasant for white to do that in many positions. And it's a consideration here. Just a trade-off compared to b3 going for this. Okay. All right, so that's something for each of you to think about from this game.